Seated. On Wednesday evening of this past week, we gathered here in this place for worship. The season of Lent for us begins with ashes being rubbed on our foreheads, traced there in the form of a cross. And as the cross of ash is made there, we hear the mournful yet hopeful words, "Remember, you are dust, and to dust you will return." With those words, we are invited to take the first step of a spiritual journey, a journey that will take us from the ashes of sin and death into the resurrection and new life that God has prepared for us through Jesus Christ. The word Lent means spring. And it's an invitation to a springtime for the soul, a time of growth and new life. Lent is 40 days long, patterned after the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. It is 40 days to cleanse our lives of everything that takes us away of loving God and loving one another as God intends. It is 40 days to learn anew what it means to live by the grace of God alone and not by what we can supply for ourselves. The first Sunday in Lent also always brings this gospel story, the story of Jesus' temptation by Satan in the wilderness. And of all the Gospels, Mark's Gospel is the most succinct account of the temptation story. No sooner has Jesus come up out of the water of his baptism by John in the Jordan River than the Spirit drives him into the wilderness. And Mark wraps up the whole story of the temptation in just one verse, verse 13 of today's reading. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Mark, who is known for brevity in all things, spends more time in his gospel account on the baptism of Jesus than he spends on the temptation of Jesus by Satan in the wilderness. And Mark doesn't give us any specifics about these temptations, about the nature of these temptations that Satan brings to Jesus as the other gospel accounts do. And so I've been wondering about this, why it is that Mark told his gospel story in this way. And I think that maybe this is because Mark wanted his listeners, his readers, to focus not so much on the temptations themselves, but instead to focus on the power and presence of God in the wilderness. At the baptism of Jesus, God's presence and power is hard to deny. The heavens are torn open, the Spirit descends like a dove, and a voice from heaven is heard, "You are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." And maybe after an event like that, everyone, including Jesus, was expecting there to be moment after moment of glorious times to follow. Experiences in which God's presence was undeniable and God's power would be seen in mighty ways. But that's not what happened. Instead, Jesus was led from this spectacular moment of his baptism to a long and lonely time in the wilderness. For 40 days and 40 nights, Satan was there, the wild beasts were there, and the temptations were there. But the heavens stayed shut. There were no doves, and there was no voice heard from heaven speaking reassuring words. But Mark is also clear to point out that God was in the wilderness too. And he ends this account of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness with these words, "And the angels waited on him." Unlike the gospel writers Luke and Matthew, Mark rarely mentions angels. And so when he does, it's a clue for us that we're to sit up and take note of this. Mark remembers, and he wants us to remember also, that God was present with the people of Israel when they wandered and struggled in the wilderness for 40 years. God is in this wilderness with Jesus, and God will be with us also in the wild, frightening, and lonely places of our lives. The wilderness throughout the scriptures is more than a geographic location. The wilderness is also a place of trial and struggle and temptation for God's people. It's a place where God's people are traveling from one place to another, and on that journey they struggle with who they are, and they struggle with trusting God. The wilderness is also a place where God's people are given an opportunity to experience like no other place what it means to rely on the strength and power of God. Today, the gospel reading began with the baptism of Jesus. And Jesus' baptism reminds us of our baptisms in his name as well. And in our baptisms, we also remarkably are given the affirmation that we are God's beloved children. It's an affirmation that's promised to us for the whole of our lives. And this affirmation is an identity that Jesus went to the cross and rose again to bestow on us. And yet I think in the wilderness, perhaps the greatest temptation of all is to question that God-given identity and to begin to wonder if God is really present at all. It's clear from the gospel reading that Jesus didn't choose the wilderness. He was driven there by God's Spirit. And like Jesus, you and I, we rarely volunteer or sign up to enter the wilderness. We don't look for places of struggle and trial and temptation. And we rarely have an opportunity to prepare for those things when they come our way. We're usually not told what's coming next, and there are very few dress rehearsals in life. The wilderness, I think, can take all kinds of form in our life's journey. It could be a relationship that we're not sure how to make better, how to reconcile. It might be a frightening health challenge or a job loss or any kind of pull that we're experiencing to something less than the fullness of life that God intends for us. And often the only thing that we have to cling to in the wilderness is the knowledge and the promise that we belong to God and that God is with us. Over the past few days, I've been especially taken by the story of 26-year-old Karla Mueller. Maybe you've seen her beautiful face as well online or on TV. Moved by human suffering that she witnessed, Karla took off across the world on a humanitarian mission. And she was captured and recently died while she was being held in captivity by the terror group ISIS. Somehow in her captivity, she managed to send her family a letter through others that had been held with her and were released. And I am struck by the following part of her letter to her family that was written several months ago. Karla said, "I remember Mom always telling me that all in all, in the end, the only one you really have is God. I have come to a place in my experience where, in every sense of the word, I have surrendered myself to our Creator because literally there was no one else. By God and by your prayers, I have felt tenderly cradled in free fall. I have been shown in darkness light, and have learned that even in prison, one can be free. I am grateful. I cannot imagine the wilderness she faced, but her letter is a witness that in that wilderness, God was there. The world that we live in says that who we are is all about what we do, or about what we own, or about how we appear. And we are given the message again and again that we really can do this all without God's help. But the gospel offers us another way to understand ourselves. The gospel says that we are not what we can do or what we own or how we appear. The gospel says that we are something more, something that cannot be taken from us. What matters most about us is whose we are. And we are God's beloved children, and God promises never, never to let go. No matter what wilderness we face or what wild beasts are threatening, here is the promise that we are God's beloved, and wherever we go, whatever is next, God is there. That is the gift. And the promise is this, that somehow that will be enough. May these 40 days be a time for you and I to learn anew what it means to live by the grace of God alone. Amen.